point out that Towards the C Theory of Time is an unfortunate title because the C theory doesn't work with time-directed notions like towards. So, when I'm presenting something, like, I call this a theory of time, there's always the danger that I'm going to be tackling kind of too big a question and kind of be stuck in too much navel gazing and wonder about this kind of like fundamental issue. The notion of time is kind of created, maybe more than any other topic in philosophy, a lot of confusion. Like famously, this guy, St. Augustine, said about time that if no one asks of me, I know what it is, but if I wish to explain to him who asks, I know not. It's kind of a classic kind of attitude of the first year going to a seminar, having sort of semi-read the literature. So what I want to really get at in this talk, really this is an overview of a book that I'm currently writing, and the book is analysing this hypothesis, what I call the time-directed universe hypothesis, which is, in brief, the idea that the universe is some kind of time-directed process. And this is something which is quite, sort of underlies a lot of our thoughts, both in science and physics, and also in philosophy in general. And it's the sort of thought which underlies the idea of things like initial conditions and not final conditions, determining the evolution of systems, causes temporarily preceding their effects. This issue that states of systems, particularly in quantum mechanics, tend to be written in time-directed terms, such as in terms of the prior measurement and not obviously the future measurement outcome, which we don't know. With preferred vectorial properties, that is, we standardly represent a state of a system as having some particular velocity, when if we were to view the process backwards in time, we'd assign opposite velocity and things like that. And this kind of talk spreads much more widely into philosophical ways of thinking about, well, particularly modality, the idea that things depend upon the past and not the future, that dispositions of things or objects or particles or whatever tend to be used to explain how they determine future and not past behaviour, and there's this widespread tendency of thinking that chances are inherently future-directed and not past-directed, and so on. And in this book, I'm defending an alternative position, so I'm giving a defense of the rejection of this time-directed universe hypothesis, which I call the temporally adirectional universe, or tau for short. As you should all know, tau is a symbol for proper time. That's the first joke. So what's this hypothesis here? Well, the idea is quite simply that time is not directed. And the aim of this talk is really to just get some grasp on what I mean when I say time is not directed, and what exactly we have to reject. And the main aim is not to defend a radical thesis here, but to sort of defend an eminently sensible position. So how we should go about thinking about the adirectionality of time in a way which captures the standard ways in which we want to talk about processes in preferred time-directed language. I'm going to distinguish between these two questions which are usually asked of time in philosophical discourse. So in the first case, it's common to hold that time passes in some interesting sense. This is the idea of temporal passage. But I'm more interested in this slightly weaker question of whether time has a privileged direction, which I call the directionality of time. Now, on the first picture, it's common to think of time as having this kind of tripartite structure. There's the past, there's the present, there's the future, and time flows or passes insofar as what we call the present moment appears to kind of move towards the future and kind of make the past bigger and so on. And this is a position which is defended by the so-called A theory of time. So the A theory of time holds that the apparent passage of time and the way that we kind of psychologically divide time up in terms of past, present, and future reflects some mind-independent property of the world. It's not merely some sort of projection. Whereas B theorists of time reject this and hold something along the lines of that this structure as being just some projection upon the world. There's no kind of mind-independent fact of the matter as to what the present moment is, and so on. Now, clearly this dispute between the A theory and the B theory has a largely kind of psychological component, insofar as the model here is meant to correspond to how we conceptualize time in terms of the memory of past event, anticipation of future events, and the supposed kind of primacy of our experience of present events and things like that. And the A theory of time is largely a realist attitude towards this, right? It's the idea that our psychological breaking down of time really successfully represents some property of time in and of itself, whereas the B theory rejects this. But it's not clear that this atheoretic ontology is really designed to explain anything that goes beyond why it is that we perceive time in such and such a way. But this second question of whether time has a privileged direction, I think, has much wider relevance, and is kind of particularly interesting in a lot of questions in the foundations of physics. And this is what I take to distinguish what I'm going to call the B theory of time and the C theory of time. Insofar as the B theory of time, which is usually presented in just its negative terms in its rejection of temporal passage, the B theory of time is committed to some sort of primitive directionality of time, whereas what I call the C theory of time, which is not something which has been defended in the literature, but I'm trying to kind of promote it, at least the terminology, the kind of thought behind it is present in a number of thinkers, but the terminology not so much. I'm going to kind of give it a run for its money, exactly how we should think about the C theory, how we should think about time kind of lacking a privileged direction. Now, this issue of whether time has a direction is clearly independent of our temporal psychology, insofar as this issue of directionality appears to play quite an important role in what I call third-person or kind of scientific explanations of phenomena. If we think in terms of how things look along the forwards direction of time and how things look along the backwards direction of time, they look importantly different, and the forwards and backwards directions of time appear to give very different explanatory stories. And as I've said, it's really standard to explain things in terms of initial and not final conditions, and to think of states of the system as time-directed. And none of these seems to play some important relationship to our temporal psychology, but more we should think that the B theory of time, the idea that time has a privileged direction, can in principle have some sort of greater explanatory role. And the question with which I'm really interested is, does the general time-directed language that we use and the tendency that we have to represent processes in time-directed ways reflect any objective time directionality nature? So I'm going to go through the following things in the talk. Firstly, I'll introduce a bit more detail these different pictures of time that I'm talking about, namely A time, B time, and C time. And then I'm going to draw an analogy between how the B theory of time usually treats the concept of temporal passage, and how the C theory of time can treat the issue of time directionality. In the third section, I'm going to argue that the kind of issues which are usually thought to promote the idea that time is directed, namely the existence of temporally asymmetric phenomena and irreversible processes and so on, actually better motivates the C theory of time. So I'm going to say that the fact that we prefer to describe things in the future direction does not in any sense require time itself to be directed. And in the final section, I'm going to reflect a bit on the terminology here and give a little quick historical argument as to why the position called the C theory of time has not been defended in the literature, but the B theory has. So the guy, kind of very unflatteringly depicted here, John McTaggart, Ellis McTaggart, he had his name twice. He wrote this paper in 1908 called The Unreality of Time. It's like a very infamous paper because it makes a kind of a very dodgy argument that time is not real. But in this paper, he introduced a terminology of the A series, the B series, and the C series, and that's become somewhat canonical in the philosophy of time literature, particularly the A series and the B series. And he introduces the A series as a series of positions running from the past to the present and to the future, and the B series as a series of positions which runs from earlier to later. And the important thing that he picks on that differentiates these series is that only on the A series do events really change. So we think about the A series and the B series relating the First and Second World Wars. On the B series, we see that the First World War is earlier than the Second World War, and this is not something which changes over time. But on the A series, both wars start out as future, and then each becomes present, and then they both move into the past. McTaggart thought that it's this apparent change of events over time which is essential to the concept of time. The time can only be real if this is a kind of a real process that happens in the universe, that events really undergo this change in their properties. He says that time involves change, and the only change that we can get is from future to present and from present to past. I'm not going to seek to defend his claim there. There's definitely an equivocation on the concept of change, which is quite important. But McTaggart had this idea that we need this idea of the passage of time to distinguish time from space. He thought that the B series, the way it represents events in terms of these static earlier than relations, is too much like how we think of how space organizes objects. So you can kind of see this supposed analogy here, that if we say that on this picture the universe is really changing its properties, should we also say that this ruler really changes from being blue to red by being blue at one spatial end and red at the other spatial end? McTaggart thought that we need more of a disanalogy here in order to understand the important difference between the concepts of time and space. And that's the best one can say about this argument. But the way the literature's gone since McTaggart is that B theorists of time have just denied that this is some sort of conceptually necessary feature of time. So the B theory of time holds that all we need is this arrangement of events in terms of earlier and later, and this gets what's crucially essential about time and what distinguishes it from space. So this guy, Hugh Mellor, written two books, Real Time 1 and 2, where he's specifically responding to McTaggart. He's reclaiming the idea of the reality of time in terms of the B series. He says that the sense in which events undergo the change from being future to present to past is just a matter of perspective, right? And events becoming present and becoming past are not themselves genuine events. That's not an instance of the universe changing. Nothing objectively becomes present. It just appears that way to time-directed beings like ourselves. And Mellor and a number of other B theorists have argued that what really distinguishes time and space is rather that time is something like the causal dimension of space-time, which, of course, space is meant to not be. So he says that B theorists do not need to invoke change, like McTaggart does, to distinguish time from space. They can use causation to do this, since time is the only dimension in which causes are always separated from by being earlier than their effects. Now, towards the end of the talk, I'm going to argue against this demarcation of time and space and give an independent argument that the C theory has the resources to do this without involving these notions of earlier than and later than and other such time-directed notions. Now, the third of McTaggart's series, the C series, has featured in a much smaller amount of philosophical literature for a bunch of reasons. So whereas the A series and the B series have kind of spawned the A and B theories of time, which are kind of really ubiquitous in the literature, there has been no C theory of time defended. And in my thesis, as Brian was mentioning, this was something that was trying to establish why that's the case, when the question of whether time has a privileged direction seems to be kind of so pressing in the foundations of physics. So the C series McTaggart introduces as follows. He said the C series determines the order, but not the direction of a set of events. So if we think of the C series as ordered by something like temporal betweenness, it gives us basically the bare ordering of what's between, which event is between which other pairs of events. The B series, as opposed to that, orders things in terms of earlier than. He says that if the C series can run NOP like this, then there are two possible B series. Right? There's the one which runs from M to P, and the one that runs from P to M. So there's this kind of differing structure between the B and C series, which is the thing that I'm interested in. So we can kind of flesh out these pictures a little bit more by thinking of the different kinds of temporal structure they commit to. So this is the only bit of the talk where I'm going to go into the details of how relativity affects things, but if we imagine that we have some set of events and they're kind of mutually time-like separated, so they form some sort of timeline, then that gives us the bare kind of C-theoretic structure that we need to think about how these different theories attach temporal structure to these events. So firstly, if we have these time-like separated events, they will form this basic linear ordering, which you can call line, and all three series commit to that. Then imagine that we add an arrow to this to give a directed ordering to this. This gives us back a B series. And finally, if we pick one of those members and say that's the present member and divide the others into past and future and so on, then we get back something that looks like an A series. So we have these three different pictures of time that kind of fundamentally differ in terms of the temporal or the structure that they assign to time. So for any C series of these three events, here where y is between x and z, there are going to be a bunch of different possible A series that correspond to this. There's going to be the ones where they're all in the past, where they're all in the future or in the past, and then one each where each member is present. So there's kind of this multiplicity of possible A series that corresponds to any one C series. And for the B series, there's going to be, as McTaggart says, two possible earlier than orderings of this C series. Whereas when we just go down to the C series, we kind of do away with all this extra structure and we're left with this simple kind of linear ordering. And in order to kind of choose between these theories, one approach we can have is to think what all this extra structure really does. Right? So the A theory and the B theory attach this extra structure to time that goes beyond the C series. And it will be interesting if any of that structure did some sort of explanatory work that would motivate being an A theorist or a B theorist as opposed to being a C theorist. So I'll start by looking at how this can work in terms of the A series to kind of promote what I call like a deflationist approach to the A series. So we can think about how the different A series differ. I mean, how would these two A series kind of represent different possible worlds? Well, you know, the standard thought is that there's some sort of present moment, and the fact about where it's located is kind of independent of us, it varies independently of us, and these events really undergo some genuine change in their properties. And this sort of thought is at the centre of McTaggart's main worry about the A series. This is what underlies his argument against the reality of time. So he was troubled by the fact that these pictures look incompatible insofar as they represent each event as having these inconsistent set of temporal determinations. So we can ask on the A series, is one or one past, present, or future? Well, in a sense, it's past and it's present and it's future. So we have this kind of collapse of these incompatible determinations. And the literature on this gets so messy that I'm going to kind of do you a favour by not getting into it too much. But I'll pick on one interesting response that was given to McTaggart's paradox by the guy that was charged with editing McTaggart's book. So McTaggart died in 1927, I think, when he was on like the 6th or 7th draft of his book, The Nature of Existence. I don't know why he had to do so many drafts, but there it goes. And his colleague in Cambridge, Charlie Broad, was given, or kind of gave himself the duty of editing this book. And the book is very long, and it's some super dense metaphysics. Broad, after kind of putting this all together, decided to write this 3-volume work, an examination of McTaggart's philosophy, where he pretty much comments on everything McTaggart says in this book. And on the issue of McTaggart's paradox, he says, well, one way that we seem to be able to get around this paradox is by thinking that there should be 2 time dimensions, not just one. That the A theory of time requires this second time dimension. That there's kind of regular time that gives us the time order of events, namely that this is X is earlier than Y and Y is earlier than Z. But then we have this kind of second time dimension we can call supertime, which gives us the order in which those events become present and change their determinations from being future to present to past. And by kind of introducing this extra logical space, we can get around this paradox. We imagine that events are somehow kind of spread out in this extra temporal dimension. Now, this kind of model is coherent, although it sounds quite dubious. But the main issue here is, well, what would all this extra structure be doing, right? Why would we want to appeal to such extra structure in order to explain something? And that kind of brings us to this wider worry about the A theory of time, and motivates why we should think that we needn't commit to a world with a full structure of the A series. So, as I say, it appears to be misguided to interpret the A series as externalist. And what I mean by this is it's misguided to think of the different properties of the A series as reflecting kind of mind-independent properties of the world, rather than just kind of indexical properties of how we relate to different times and so on. And this comes from the worry about whether we can actually be non-present. So if we think about how the A series changes over time, and we use this kind of Charlie Broad structure of ordering the A series, we'll see that there's only going to be this kind of infinitesimal sliver of the whole model which corresponds to being in the present. There's going to be way more copies of you, which, by hypothesis will have all the same experiences and so on this model, which will be either past or future. Right? And we suppose that the super time in this case is infinitely long, and it's going to be, it's going to approach probability 1 that you're actually non-present. Right, so there's going to be countless more non-present versions of you than present versions of you. So by this model, we should be committed to the belief that we're actually non-present. And this is where thinking of the A series as something externalist, as something which represents some mind-independent properties of time, kind of undermines itself. Because the A theory is put forward in order to give some basic explanation of why we experience time in some way. If we take ourselves to be located in the present, and that there's something special about the presentness of experience, this model is going to do a really bad job of capturing this. Because, as this argument's been made by people like Craig Bourne and David Bradley Mitchell, well, a theory which entails that we're more likely to be non-present than present is just, necessarily a terrible theory of trying to explain why it is that we perceive ourselves as present. And I call this the detachment problem, right? It's a detachment problem because we need terms like the now to be attached to us. It doesn't seem a reasonable worry whether or not we're really located in the now or not. So any theory which raises this kind of skepticism should not be considered a good theory. And now there's such an obvious resolution to this problem that you're probably already aware of it. Well, we shouldn't treat the now as some sort of name of an object, but merely as an indexical term. Right, now just picks out the time that one is talking, so every token of the word now and kind of cognate terms and so on is going to be implicitly indexed by the time that we're talking. Right, so that in a sense, it's just an illusion that there's some now which follows us. Really, there's many different tokens of the now, which are kind of indexed to all these different times at which we find ourselves to be located. And this approach, what I call an internalist understanding of the A-series, does not involve any commitment to any observer-independent A-theoretic structure. Right? There's no sense in which the four-dimensional world on this account changes as time passes. It's just kind of an indexical element of experience. But rather we can think that the A-series is just how we can refer to a B world or a C world from within. And this metaphor of how things look from within is what motivates the terminology of internalism here, as opposed to externalism, whereas externalism is more like the God's eye perspective. Now, that's kind of set in stone in the literature. The B theorist response to the A theory is very much along those lines. That's how we should treat the terminology of the A series. We shouldn't think that the now refers to some object, it's just an indexical. But can we think, can we apply a similar explanatory strategy in the case of the B series? So we have this structure here of the B series where we have two possible B series for any set of time-separated events. And these two worlds differ primarily over which events are earlier than which other events. So we can ask, does this extra structure offer any explanatory value? Namely, does the idea that does the fact that we ordinarily represent things in time-directed terms require this kind of extra structure? Does it require this kind of ontology of B facts? Or are B facts just indexical like kind of the terminology of the A series is? And the argument that I make is that a B world, a world ordered in terms of earlier than, is just what a C world looks like from within. It should be thought of in very similar ways to how the B theorist thinks about the A theory. Namely that we don't need an ontology of time-directed facts or anything like that in order to explain time asymmetric phenomena. And I'll argue exactly how the B theory faces this analogous detachment problem that the A theory faces. So this is the University of Sydney Physics Road, where the physics department is. This is where I used to work, and kind of I'm one for visual metaphors, and you'll notice that Physics Road is a one-way street. This is where the centre for time is located, where there's a bunch of philosophers that think it's highly dubious that time has a direction. So it's like a middle finger to those people. The idea of physics and science in general, and the world being some sort of one-way street, is really what we're trying to get at in this debate. That unlike the distinction between the A theory and the B theory, the distinction between the B theory and the C theory looks quite interesting as regards scientific explanation. And this is because, as I said, time asymmetric processes typically have some sort of preferred time-directed representation. Like, it's really common to hold that, that entropy increases, that, glasses smash when you drop them and things like that. It's so standard to represent time asymmetric processes in future directed terms that it's not something that we really think too much about. But if we're a C theorist, we should think, well, it should make no odds as to whether we describe things towards the future or towards the past, because we're not changing our description of the fundamental facts. There should be no greater sense in which entropy increases than entropy decreases. If we switch the temporal labeling, we shouldn't be changing any fundamental facts. So, is this a problem for the B theory? In general, scientific explanations kind of have this property of being time-directed, and that when we appeal to causes and effects, causes are kind of always earlier than their effects, except in retrocausal quantum mechanics, but I won't be talking about that. And that in general, when we try to describe our world backwards in time, it looks kind of really odd, and it looks like it's a world full of inexplicable coincidences that don't fit into any natural causal structure. So does any of this require an ontology of time-directed facts, such as the B theory? And I mean, the argument that I make is, well, no, it doesn't. And it doesn't for very kind of analogous reasoning to that used by the B theorist against the A series. So as I said earlier, although I'm kind of trying to promote this terminology of the C theory of time, the general thought behind it has been expressed by a number of philosophers and physicists in the past. In particular, someone that is a kind of motivation for this work is Hans Reichenbach. So when Reichenbach is writing his book, The Direction of Time, one of the early sections is on time order in classical mechanics. And the relevant feature of time in classical mechanics is it forms an order and not a direction in Reichenbach's terminology. And that's because he takes classical mechanics to not involve any fundamentally irreversible processes. So it should make no difference as to whether you use the theory to explain some processes given to you towards the future or towards the past. It has the same ability to describe such a process. So he says that since in time reversal invariant theories, it's always possible to construct a converse description of a process, namely a description in negative time, we should think that positive and negative time supply equivalent descriptions, and it would be meaningless to ask which of the two descriptions is true. And the same general sentiment is also put forward by a contemporary of Reichenbach, the cosmologist Thomas Gold, who says that the description of our universe in the opposite sense of time, basically from future to past, sounds very strange, but it has no conflict with any laws of physics. Our strange description is not describing another universe, or how this universe might be but is not, but it is describing the very same thing. So here they're uttering this general idea behind the C theory, which is that we should think that positive and negative time do not describe two different possible worlds. When we describe things in positive and negative time, what we're doing is giving two different kinds of description of the same possible world. So when we think of the action of time reversal on some system, when we take a model to its time reverse, we should think that those two models, in virtue of being the time reverse of each other, effectively represent the same reality, which, put in that way, is taken to be a more controversial claim. So we can see this, the relevant asymmetry just in kind of simple pictures like this. If we view this as the initial element, this seems like a perfectly familiar process, hopefully not that familiar. It looks like this is being kind of shattered by someone singing it or something like that. But in this case, if we just flip time, we put what was the final element as the initial element, it suddenly looks like an unfamiliar process. It looks like there's some sort of anti-causal behavior going on where all these shards of glass just are kind of conspiring to reform into a nice smooth wine glass. So Reichenbach says, well, just because the two descriptions are equivalent, it doesn't mean that one is not preferred. And unfortunately, this is not a thought which Reichenbach goes on to develop. I mean, he published the book, well, he didn't publish the book was published on his behalf posthumously by his wife. So he never kind of fully got to explore a little kind of nugget of wisdom that he puts in there, which is that this idea that forwards and backwards time give equivalent descriptions is kind of fully following his account of equivalent descriptions in the nature of, or in the case of geometry. And we think that we can describe the world using a number of different geometrical systems, and we should think that the choice of a geometrical system is a matter of convention in that it doesn't alter kind of anything physical. Right? It's not incorrect to use a slightly odd geometry to represent some particular part of the world. But what he does say in that case is that for any class of equivalent descriptions with respect to geometry, there generally will be a more natural member. So we can think that just because these two pictures might be technically equivalent and that they represent the same reality, it doesn't mean that there isn't a natural description in this set of equivalent descriptions. There might be a sense in which this is more natural than this. There is an asymmetry there. And we can kind of take some of his comments about geometry and, on his behalf, think about how they would apply to the case of time. So he says, talking about Poincaré's conventionalism, that Poincaré is right if he wanted to say that the choice of one from the class of equivalent descriptions is a matter of convention, but he was mistaken if he believed that the determination of natural geometry, in the sense defined, is a matter of convention. That the natural geometry of the world of our environment is Euclidean must be regarded as a fortunate empirical fact. Right? So he says that there are these kind of empirical facts about what counts as the natural geometry of a certain situation. And we can think that in this quick footnote where he says that his talk of forwards and backwards time giving equivalent descriptions is analogous or kind of fully follows from his account of equivalent descriptions in geometry, we should think that he would similarly be committed to the idea that it's an empirical fact that this is the natural description and this is the unnatural description, even though they're technically equivalent and they represent the same reality. So the idea here is that forwards and time descriptions may be simpler or more natural, but in no sense be kind of more true, because they're not saying different things about the world. In fact, they have the same truth makers. In this sense, they describe the same world, but one can be more natural. So this is a take on how the C theory can treat this asymmetry between forwards and backwards descriptions. An alternative approach is stated by Tim Maudlin, particularly in his book, The Metaphysics Within Physics, where he kind of usefully picks up on the same terminology in a footnote. He says that what he's arguing for by being a realist about the directionality of time is a B-series theory over a C-series theory. And he says that it's on his account, it's a fundamental, irreducible fact that time is directed. And he thinks that we need this extra structure of the B-series, this idea that time is kind of fundamentally directed, in order to account for the apparent asymmetry between these kinds of picture. He says that earlier states produce later ones, and absent such a direction, there is no account of one global state being a cause and another being an effect, and so no account of which evolutions from states should be expected to be atypical and typical in which directions. So the fact that we standardly think that this is a typical evolution and this is an atypical evolution needs to be understood in terms of the full structure of the B theory of time. Whereas I've just given this kind of account of how we can get a Reichenbach route and think that the C theorists can perfectly account for this as an asymmetry in kind of naturalness of representation rather than an asymmetry in content. And we can ask the question of, well, what is missing from the C series that B theorists think is needed in order to account for this asymmetry in representation? So think about some reversible process, and here I'm borrowing an argument from a paper which you can read in much more detail online. So we have this reversible process of two idealized billiard balls coming into contact. So the blue ball knocks into the red ball, knocks it off the screen, and then we reverse it, and it appears that we have kind of the opposite set of causal facts. In the second case, it looks like it's the red ball that causes the blue ball to move. Now, on the B theory, we can entertain these as different possible processes and different worlds with different causal facts. The first thing I showed you was a world in which the blue ball caused the red ball to move. And the second video I showed you was the red ball causing the blue ball to move. But the C theory has a kind of more nuanced take on this. He says that these are just different representations of a single possible world. When I just showed you these two different models here, these models are referring to the same possible situation. You might think that in the first case it looked like the blue ball caused the red ball to move and the converse in the second, but you weren't viewing the representation of any different kind of fundamental facts or anything like that. Now, it seems that when we deal with these purely reversible situations, it's neither here nor there whether you want to be a B theorist or a C theorist. These both seem perfectly, decent ways of looking at these kind of pictures. But things get more complicated when we introduce time asymmetric situations, and particularly irreversible processes and processes that involve things like agential interaction and so on. So we replace our idealized billiard balls with realistic snooker balls on a snooker table, which is the green cloth here. And we introduce an agent here, the snooker player, which strikes the cue ball into the red ball. And when we view this on TV, we're not left in two minds as to whether really you were viewing things in the right order. We just take it to be a given that the snooker player was in control of the cue ball and ultimately in control of the red ball. But when we view this kind of picture, something strikes us as odd. Right? It seems very clear that we've just been shown this in the wrong temporal order. We don't think that when we see the second picture that suddenly the snooker player's lost his agential control. We just think that we've seen the same process but kind of played backwards in time. We still believe in the same set of kind of causal facts, namely that the snooker player was the one causing the balls to move. It's just we viewed it in the basically the wrong, the unnatural direction of time. And on the C theory, we can capture this very nicely, because on the C theory, these two motions just represent one and the same possible process. So necessarily, if they represent any particular set of causal facts, they represent the same set of causal facts in both situations, under both models. And it's only the extra structure of the B theory which allows us to distinguish the two as representing different possible worlds. So we naturally think that these two motions are fundamentally different because one kind of intuitively corresponds to a snooker shot and the other kind of intuitively does not correspond to anything we normally see. In the first case, what we see is a reasonable causal process. But in the second case, it seems that we lose the sense in which it fits a nice causal model, because the second process of the backwards running one seems to involve a number of kind of coincidences, a loss of agential control and so on, that if we're B theorists should make us think that this world does not accord to any nice kind of set of causal facts. So in this paper, I argue that the extra structure that the B theory gives us here is firstly redundant, because we can explain the asymmetry here and why we want to commit to the same causal facts in both cases very nicely on the C theory. And secondly, the B theory's extra structure actually leads us to some unnecessary skeptical problems regarding the direction of causation, which I'll go on to argue now is analogous in several key respects to that kind of model of two-dimensional time and the A series earlier. And this is because the key thing here is that the causal intuitions that we have going on are independent of any facts about the direction of time. So there's two things that we can appeal to. Firstly, the notion of control and agential control, and secondly, the issue of probability. So when we view this process like this, well, we take the snooker player's action to explain the motion of the cue ball and subsequently the red ball. But we don't, when we view it backwards, take the red ball, the movement of the red ball to, in any interesting sense, explain the motion of the cue ball. And we can think, well, could we really be in a proper situation where we can properly doubt whether the snooker player controls the balls or vice versa? And if we were really wrong about such beliefs, I mean, what would this really mean? What would be significant about a world in which despite all of the causal intuitions we have, it's really the case that everything is kind of causally running against what we take to be the natural direction of causation. And in the case of probability, when we view this taken as representing some sort of interesting backwards process, this red to white to Q motion involves a number of coincidences. For example, if we're to fully flesh out this picture, we need heat on the cloth to converge in a really nice way to kind of input some momentum into the red ball, and then we will have these kind of inverse concentrating sound waves that sort of hit the cue ball together with the red ball in order to kind of increase the momentum in the interaction. And these general probability considerations are things that generally play some constitutive role in the causal inferences that we ordinarily make. So basically these two things together, these two considerations which are independent of any putative facts about time direction, seem to be sufficient to dictate to us which is the real causal process here. The direction of time itself is not something that really seems to matter. We ought to take the movement of the cue ball and the intentions of the snooker player and so on to be the cause of the red ball's movement and not vice versa. So here it's quite clear that the extra structure that the B theory affords us doesn't give us any important explanatory power with respect to the apparent causal asymmetry between these two pictures. So the time direction independent facts, or the C theoretic facts here, are sufficient to determine which is the natural direction of the process. So what the B theory appears to give us is this extra freedom for the direction of time, the direction of causation, to be independent of our standard local observed causal environment. Right? We can think on the B theory that, like Maudlin says, that the universe as a whole has this property where later states are produced out of earlier states regardless of the material content of space-time. But it seems that nothing very interesting is gained by this extra kind of modal structure. But rather, just in the simple case of the snooker balls, it's raised these two problems. Firstly, on the B theory, it seems that causal relations are undetermined by experience in a case where they really ought not be. So without knowing which B world we're really in, we can't know whether, on the B theory, the Q action really caused the red ball's movements or not. Insofar as both causal processes are kind of theoretically a possibility, because there's no reason why, once you've got the extra structure of the B theory, that our causal inferences should accord to the actual direction of time and the direction of causation. And kind of because of this, it seems that these extra causal relations that we have on the B theory kind of lack any explanatory force. Precisely because the B theorist entertains the reality of these reverse causal processes, such as the snooker balls running backwards, that violate the standard sets of causal algorithms that we usually use to ascertain the direction of causation, such as the causal Markov condition. So in kind of simpler terms, they seem to allow for these kind of improbable, miraculous causal scenarios, so these coincidences that are only kind of properly screened off with reference to future interactions. So kind of properly conspiratorial. But on the C theory, we don't have to worry about these situations, because the two different pictures do not represent two different ontologies of causal facts. Right? There's two different ways of representing one set of causal facts, and it becomes clear which of those two representations is the natural one, which is the one that kind of properly picks out the actual causal facts in the situation. So the suggestion is that we should take the direction of time and causation and the directionality of explanation to function in analogous terms to the concept of the now. Right? We want the direction of time, the direction of causation, to follow us insofar as we wanted to match our general judgments about the directionality of time and the directionality of causal processes. And I suggest that a theory of time should not motivate skepticism as to whether, in the first case, it's really now, as we saw. That was the first attachment problem. But also a theory of time should not motivate skepticism as to whether the world really is future-directed. Right? We shouldn't have this extra skeptical problem of whether agents are really causes of their perceived actions and not effects, whether glasses really smash and don't kind of manage to magically recompose, whether entropy really increases, and so on. This standard set of ways in which we represent time asymmetric processes should just be thought to be a given. We shouldn't have to worry about whether it actually fails to correspond to the way the world really works. And it's only thinking in terms of this inflated structure of the B theory that we can have these kind of skeptical problems. So in short, we should take the A series and the B series to be effectively internalist representations of the C series. Now, I kind of picked on part of this quote earlier from Tim Maudlin in dealing with thermodynamic asymmetry in general. And his worry is that, well, if we take the state of any thermal system and we think about its microstates, it's going to be the case that if we time reversed every single atom in some particular gas at any point, then that gas would then perform this kind of anti-thermodynamical behavior. It would contract and so on. So if we are to take a look at the universe at any particular time and think about how it actually evolves towards the past, we should think that the past-directed evolution is always highly suspect. It's highly unlikely. And if we're to think of it as a possibility that the world really is running backwards as much as it's running forwards, that should strike us as very difficult to explain. So Maudlin says that this kind of issue, the fact that things really look weird towards the past, that's just explained away if we assume that there is this privileged direction of time. There's a fact of the matter as to which states really produce which. And if we think like that, then we should think that, well, there's no sense in which earlier states really come out of later states, so we shouldn't have to worry about why it is that past-directed descriptions look very unlikely. So he says that this is provided by a direction of time, and absent this kind of direction, there's no account of which evolutions from states should be expected to be atypical and typical in which directions. And the idea, I think, that he's getting at here is that we need to hold that we're in a world with a full structure of the B theory in which only probable evolutions actually occur or unfold in order to rule out the meaningfulness of the improbable past-directed evolutions. Right? When we see the two pictures of the snooker balls, we need to be a B theorist and think, well, really, it's this first picture that corresponds to reality and not the second. In order to do that, in order to rule out the meaningfulness of the second one, we need to be B theorists. But, I mean, as I've argued, it's not exactly clear how this really resolves the issue. Because on the C theory, there is no meaningful sense in which things really evolve towards the past. I think that's a mischaracterization of his opponent here. Rather, it's natural to hold things to evolve towards the future. And on the C theory, we actually avoid this kind of skepticism about past-directed evolutions entirely by just simply kind of narrowing down the set of possibilities. So the key problem that Maudlin and a number of others are really getting at here is why there is like a low entropy end at one end of the universe. And I'm not going to go into details here, but just kind of point towards the issues and maybe we can discuss it in the questions. But the general problem here is statable in terms of the C series. We don't need to talk in terms of earlier and later in order to kind of bring about the improbability of there ever having been a highly low, kind of particularly low entropy state at the beginning of the universe. That is, entropic behavior is correlated insofar as, regardless of whether we describe things towards the future or towards the past, there's either only entropy increasing behavior or entropy decreasing behavior. And this is something which can be explained, kind of understood in terms of betweenness, not just in terms of time direction. And the resolution to the kind of the general problem of thermodynamic asymmetry ought to be able to function in terms of the C series and not just the B series. So the C theorist here just holds that there is no sense in which the problem can be kind of gotten away with by just stating that the low entropy end of the universe just is the initial state of the universe and not the final state of the universe. But we can talk about it a bit more at the end. Now, so I have 5 minutes left. Okay, so in 5 minutes or less, I'm going to go back to McTaggart and say why some silly things that he wrote ultimately led to the B theory of time being taken as the default kind of physics-friendly position rather than the C theory. So we have these different pictures here. The main thing that goes against the C series, in the few places where it's mentioned in the literature, is that it's kind of always presented as a non-temporal series. It's not a time series on McTaggart's account, so therefore there should be no sort of C theory of time. He says that the C series is a series of permanent relations to one another of those realities which in time are events. That's not temporal because it involves no change but only an order. So he says that the C series is non-temporal, but it's non-temporal in exactly the same sense in which the B series is non-temporal, because it doesn't involve kind of A series change. It doesn't involve this kind of changing properties of events, just like the B series. So to think about how these different theories work here, McTaggart says that time is real if and only if the A series is real, and he has his extra argument that the A series is not real and therefore time is not real. But he does say that if this misperception did not arise, basically if the illusion of the existence of the A series did not arise, he says that the C series still would exist, while the A and B series would not appear to exist. He has this kind of strange thought that in order to understand things as ordered from earlier to later, these notions presuppose that time really passes from earlier to later. And this is an argument that he doesn't really defend, but it's played a funny historical role in how the literature's gone. But McTaggart ultimately thinks that the C series is real, but it's not temporal. Whereas Meller, for example, to use a kind of a token B theorist, says that the B series is sufficient for real time and the B series is real. So we can think about these two different questions: which series is sufficient for time to be real, and which series are actually real? And this gives us these different possibilities. We can call this the real line here. So anything on this side would correspond to a theory of time, and anything down here will correspond to like an error theory of time, where time is not real. And we find McTaggart down here because he thinks that the C series is real, but he thinks that real time requires the A series. So we don't have enough temporal structure in reality for time to be real. Whereas Meller falls nicely here, saying that what's sufficient for time is the reality of the B series, and the B series is real. And then I'm there putting myself as the token C theorist, arguing that, well, the C series is sufficient for time and the C series is real. We can fill this out with a bunch of other people. There's George Ellis and a bunch of A theorists, Dean Zimmerman and William Lane Craig and Tim Morgan and so on, that kind of self-identify as A theorists and B theorists. McTaggart's the outlier because he's the one that thinks that time is not real. But McTaggart's arguments are very strange, looked at from kind of a present lens. He says that as I say, the A series together with the C series is sufficient to give us time, and no other elements are required. And that the B series itself is not ultimate. So he thinks that the B series is some sort of funny construction, got from putting the A series on top of the C series. But he also says that the B series can't exist except as temporal. So if the A series is not real, therefore the B series cannot be real. And this has played a funny role in the literature. So firstly, we have the question of whether a particular time series is autonomous of the other time series. McTaggart holds that the B series is not, but B theorists hold that it is. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, you're just at time right now, so you
Okay.
can take a few minutes to go.
Okay, I'll just quickly wrap up. And there's this other issue of whether a time series kind of is intrinsically temporal. So McTaggart says that the temporality of the B series is inherited from the A series, and without the A series it's no longer temporal. And again, the B theorists hold that, well, the B series is efficient for time, so we should think that the B series is inherently temporal. What we can say is that if we go along with the B theorists and say that the B series is autonomous, then it would have to be non-temporal by McTaggart's lights, because it doesn't contain A series change. So in this sense, the B theorist's autonomous B series just is the C series plus a direction. And that these arguments that McTaggart made about autonomy and temporality are what's confused things in the literature. Once we reject this outlandish claim that real change requires the A series, then the argument that the C series is not a time series, this is unsound. And yet it's something that does appear kind of unanimously in the literature for whatever reason. Whatever we can say about change in the B series, we can get back in the C series, it just lacks a direction. But there's no good reason, I think, that the direction of time should make any difference here as to whether a series is temporal or not. Because even on the C series, there's a number of ways in which time differs from space. The main thing that I elaborate on in the book is that time is kind of not really the causal dimension, but it's the pseudo-causal dimension. It's the one across which dynamical laws apply. Right? The laws of physics seem to prefer time explanations rather than space explanations. And even if all the relevant processes or laws were time symmetric, we'd still have an asymmetry between time and space at the level of the application of dynamical laws, as is kind of looked at and got a lot of detail by Craig Hunter's book. So it seems like it's a historical accident that the B series has been taken to save time as opposed to the C series. So to sum up everything I've been talking about, so I've said that there's no clear reason why the C series fails to provide an adequate account of time. Just as the B series is motivated to take the A series to be what a B world looks like from within, the C theorist is motivated to take the B series to be what a C world looks like from within. And far from providing any kind of useful explanatory power, I've argued that the extra structure that the B theory gives us actually appears to be at odds with our general causal reasoning. And the fact that we prefer to describe the universe from past to future as opposed to future to past is both compatible with the C theory, and I think it's best explained in terms of the C theory. So as I said at the beginning, I wanted to defend something which is sensible but not radical, namely this adirectional universe hypothesis, the idea that time is not directed. And what I've said is that in rejecting the time-directed universe hypothesis, the C theorist is taking the directionality or the apparent directionality of time very seriously, just as the B theorist takes the psychology of time flow seriously. On the C theory, we do not need to hold that time is fundamentally directed in order to explain why it is that it's useful to represent processes in time-directed terms.